I once heard that the quietest cry for help is the one spoken by someone who has already stopped believing anyone will come. Ethan Sullivan stepped out of his black sedan beneath a gray November sky as cold rain drummed steadily against the cracked pavement outside an aging brick warehouse on the edge of Brooklyn. He had come to inspect a property connected to a legitimate redevelopment project, expecting nothing more than another routine business meeting before returning to Manhattan. The neighborhood was nearly deserted except for the distant rumble of freight trains and the occasional passing truck. As his security team waited respectfully near the entrance, Ethan walked alone toward the building, studying faded architectural plans on his tablet. Just as he reached the rusted loading dock, a faint sound interrupted his concentration. At first he thought it was only the wind slipping through broken windows, but then he heard it again. It was not a scream. It was not even loud enough to be called a cry. It was the fragile voice of someone who had almost forgotten how to ask for help. Ethan immediately looked toward the second floor where an old steel door stood closed behind layers of dust and peeling paint. He raised one hand, signaling his security team to remain where they were, and quietly climbed the narrow staircase alone. Every step echoed through the abandoned hallway until he reached the locked door. He knocked firmly once. No answer came. Then, after several silent seconds, a barely audible whisper drifted through the wood. "Please, do not leave." Ethan's expression changed instantly. He tried the handle. It would not move. Without hesitation, he called the local authorities, reported the emergency, and after receiving guidance to act to protect an apparently endangered person while help was on the way, he forced the weakened, deteriorated door open using its damaged frame rather than striking at anyone. The old hinges finally gave way with a loud crack, allowing daylight to spill into the small room beyond. Sitting quietly against the far wall was a young woman wrapped in a faded blanket. She looked exhausted, her clothes worn from time and hardship, yet what struck Ethan most was not her appearance. It was the remarkable calm in her eyes, as though surviving difficult days had become more familiar than hoping for better ones. She blinked several times as the sunlight reached her face, shielding her eyes with trembling fingers. Ethan slowly removed his suit jacket and placed it gently around her shoulders before kneeling several feet away so she would not feel cornered. His voice remained steady and respectful. "My name is Ethan. You are safe now." The young woman looked at him for a long moment, uncertain whether to believe words she had never heard before. Tears slowly gathered in her eyes, yet she did not ask who he was or why he had come. Instead, she whispered the only question that seemed to matter. "Please, can you check on my little brother first?" Ethan frowned gently. "Where is he?" She lowered her eyes. "St. Matthew Children's Medical Center. Room 312. His name is Noah Bennett." Even in that moment, when she herself desperately needed medical attention, every thought remained focused on someone else. Ethan quietly repeated the information to one of his trusted assistants waiting outside and instructed him to verify Noah's condition immediately through the hospital. Several minutes later, emergency responders arrived and carefully escorted the young woman from the building. As she stepped into the fresh air for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she looked toward the cloudy sky with quiet disbelief. The world had continued moving without her, yet somehow it had not forgotten her completely. Ethan walked beside her without asking painful questions, offering only quiet reassurance whenever she looked uncertain. As the ambulance doors closed, his phone finally rang. It was his assistant calling from the hospital. Ethan answered immediately, listened carefully for several silent seconds, and slowly looked back toward the young woman. What he had just learned about Noah Bennett would change everything they both believed about the past 2 years. The truth that changes a life rarely arrives with celebration. More often, it comes through a quiet sentence spoken at exactly the right moment. Ethan Sullivan listened carefully as his assistant spoke from St. Matthew Children's Medical Center. "Noah Bennett is safe," the voice reported. "He has been receiving treatment here for nearly 2 years through an anonymous charitable medical fund. The hospital confirms he is stable, and the staff describes him as one of their most optimistic young patients." Ethan glanced through the ambulance window toward the young woman sitting silently inside. Relief immediately softened her exhausted expression the moment she saw his face. He climbed into the ambulance only after asking permission from the medical team, making certain not to overwhelm her. Sitting several feet away, he spoke gently. Your brother is safe. He is receiving excellent care. The young woman closed her eyes as tears quietly rolled down her cheeks. For several long moments, she simply breathed, as though those few words had lifted a weight she had carried for years. Thank you, she whispered. That is all I needed to know. Ethan studied her with growing curiosity. Most people rescued from such difficult circumstances would immediately ask about themselves, their future, or their safety. She had asked only about her younger brother. When the ambulance reached one of Manhattan's most respected private medical centers, physicians completed a thorough examination and confirmed that while she was exhausted and undernourished, she would recover fully with proper rest, nutrition, and continued medical care. Throughout every examination, she remained polite, quietly thanking every nurse and doctor who entered the room. She introduced herself only after several hours had passed. My name is Grace Bennett, she said softly. Ethan nodded. I am glad to meet you, Grace. She lowered her eyes. I am sorry you had to find me like that. Ethan answered without hesitation. You have nothing to apologize for. Later that evening, after receiving clearance from the medical staff, Ethan offered Grace a temporary stay at his family estate until she felt strong enough to decide her next steps. He made one condition absolutely clear. You will have your own room, complete privacy, and every decision about your future will remain yours. If you prefer another place to stay, I will respect that completely. Grace looked at him with visible surprise. She seemed almost unfamiliar with being offered a genuine choice. After a quiet pause, she accepted, not because of his wealth or influence, but because his calm voice carried no pressure. The Sullivan estate overlooked the Hudson River, surrounded by old trees whose golden autumn leaves drifted peacefully across winding stone paths. Grace stepped through the front entrance with hesitant uncertainty, expecting questions she could not answer. Instead, the housekeeper simply smiled warmly, welcomed her by name, and showed her to a bright guest room overlooking the gardens. Fresh flowers rested beside the window, clean clothes had been prepared in several sizes, and a handwritten note read, "Rest first. Everything else can wait." Grace gently touched the card as though kindness itself had become something unfamiliar. The following morning, she woke before sunrise out of habit. She quietly made her bed, folded every blanket with careful precision, and wandered downstairs intending to help with breakfast before anyone noticed she was awake. The kitchen staff smiled when they found her washing fruit for everyone instead of resting as instructed. When Ethan entered a few minutes later, he found Grace apologizing for using the kitchen without permission. He shook his head with a faint smile. This house is not a place where you have to earn breakfast. Grace froze for a moment, unsure how to answer. Later that afternoon, Ethan received permission from the hospital for Grace to visit Noah. The moment she entered room 312, a cheerful 12-year-old boy looked up from his book and smiled brighter than the afternoon sunlight pouring through the window. Grace, he shouted with joyful disbelief. She rushed forward and embraced him carefully, overcome with relief. Ethan quietly remained near the doorway, allowing the siblings their reunion. As he watched them laugh together through grateful tears, the attending physician approached him with an expression of quiet concern. Mr. Sullivan, the doctor, said softly, there is something about Noah's medical sponsorship that does not make sense, and I believe you need to hear it before Grace does. Sometimes the deepest sacrifice is hidden behind a smile that never asks for recognition. Ethan Sullivan quietly stepped away from Noah Bennett's hospital room and followed the attending physician into a private consultation office overlooking the East River. The doctor closed the door gently before opening a secure digital file on his computer. Everything about Noah's medical condition is exactly as we described, he began. The unusual part is how his treatment has been funded. Ethan remained silent, encouraging the physician to continue. For almost 2 years, every medical expense has been paid through a charitable trust using anonymous transfers. However, the account responsible for those donations has remained active even during periods when Grace could not possibly have contributed anything herself. Ethan studied the financial records displayed on the screen. So whoever convinced Grace that she had to sacrifice her freedom to protect Noah was never actually paying these bills. The doctor slowly nodded. That is exactly what concerns us. According to our records, Noah's treatment has been fully secured through an independent children's foundation from the very beginning. Grace's personal circumstances had absolutely no impact on his care. Ethan felt a quiet wave of concern. Grace had spent 2 years believing every difficult day she endured somehow protected her little brother. Yet the hospital's official record suggested she had been living under a carefully constructed lie. Before asking another question, Ethan requested copies of every legally available document, making certain patient privacy remained fully protected. Meanwhile, inside Noah's hospital room, Grace sat beside her younger brother while helping him finish a colorful jigsaw puzzle spread across his bed. Noah smiled constantly, his cheerful personality untouched by the difficult medical journey he had faced. "The nurses told me you finally smiled today," Noah said proudly. Grace laughed softly. "Did they really?" Noah nodded enthusiastically. "They said the man in the nice black suit makes you smile without even trying." Grace looked toward the hallway where Ethan had disappeared only minutes earlier. She lowered her eyes with quiet embarrassment before gently changing the subject. "Have you been reading all the books I brought last year?" Noah pointed toward a growing collection stacked beside the window. "Every single one. I kept them because they remind me that you always came back." Those simple words settled deeply inside Grace's heart. Every visit she had made during the past 2 years had required enormous emotional strength. Yet Noah had remembered only that she never stopped showing up. Ethan returned a few minutes later carrying fresh juice and sandwiches for both siblings. He greeted Noah warmly before quietly handing Grace a cup of tea. She accepted it with sincere gratitude, noticing once again that he never treated kindness like a favor that required repayment. As the afternoon passed, Ethan listened far more than he spoke. Through ordinary conversation, he gradually learned that Grace had once studied elementary education before leaving college unexpectedly. She loved children's literature, volunteered at local libraries whenever possible, and dreamed of becoming a reading specialist. None of those dreams had survived the past 2 years, yet they still quietly existed beneath the exhaustion visible on her face. On the drive back to the Sullivan estate that evening, Grace sat beside the passenger window watching the city lights reflect across the Hudson River. After several miles of peaceful silence, she finally spoke. "You have asked me almost nothing about where I came from." Ethan kept his attention on the road. "When you are ready to tell me, I will listen." Grace looked at him with visible surprise. Most people become impatient with silence. Ethan smiled faintly. Silence usually means someone is protecting a painful memory, not hiding bad intentions. Grace turned toward the window again as tears quietly gathered in her eyes. For the first time in years, she wondered what life might have looked like if someone had offered understanding before judgment. Later, that night, after Grace had gone upstairs to rest, Ethan remained alone in his study reviewing the hospital records. Every document pointed toward the same unsettling conclusion. Grace had built her entire life around protecting Noah from losing medical care that had never depended on her sacrifice at all. Someone had manipulated her with extraordinary precision, and the more Ethan studied the evidence, the more convinced he became that rescuing Grace from one room had only been the beginning of uncovering a far larger truth. The hardest lies to uncover are the ones built from someone else's love and sacrifice. The following morning, the Sullivan estate awakened beneath gentle sunlight spilling across the gardens. But Ethan Sullivan had already spent hours reviewing every document his legal advisors had obtained through proper channels. Each verified record strengthened the same disturbing conclusion. Grace Bennett had never been responsible for keeping Noah's medical treatment active. The charitable trust supporting his care had existed before her difficult circumstances began and had continued uninterrupted regardless of anything she believed she was doing. Someone had deliberately convinced her that her personal suffering was the price of her brother's future, even though the hospital had never required such a sacrifice. Ethan closed the final folder with quiet determination. He refused to reveal partial truths until every fact had been confirmed. Downstairs, Grace sat beside the large kitchen window helping the housekeeper prepare homemade soup that Noah had requested during her next hospital visit. She smiled politely whenever someone thanked her. Yet Ethan noticed she still apologized before accepting even the smallest kindness. When the chef insisted she sit and enjoy breakfast instead of helping, she hesitated before quietly asking, "Are you certain I am not causing trouble?" The question lingered in Ethan's mind long after the conversation ended. A person who constantly feared becoming a burden had likely spent years believing her own needs mattered less than everyone else's. Later that afternoon, Ethan accompanied Grace to a neighborhood library, where volunteers were organizing a children's reading hour. Grace had mentioned that she once loved reading stories aloud, and Ethan wanted to see her surrounded by something that reminded her of the person she had been before fear reshaped her life. At first, Grace stood quietly near the bookshelves, uncertain whether she belonged there anymore. Then one little girl approached holding a picture book almost too large for her small hands. "Would you read this with me?" the child asked shyly. Grace accepted the book with a gentle smile and began reading in a calm, expressive voice that filled the room with warmth. Soon several more children gathered around until an entire circle had formed at her feet. Ethan watched from a respectful distance as laughter gradually replaced the sadness that had shadowed Grace since the day they met. She was no longer simply surviving. For a few precious moments, she was becoming herself again. After the event, an elderly librarian approached Ethan privately. "She has a remarkable gift with children," the woman said warmly. "People who have known hardship often understand how to make others feel safe." Ethan looked toward Grace as she patiently helped a young boy choose his first chapter book. "I believe you are right," he answered quietly. That evening, after returning to the estate, Ethan invited Grace to join him on the back terrace overlooking the river. Warm tea rested between them as the sun slowly disappeared behind the skyline. Grace finally broke the peaceful silence. "Do you think people can ever truly become who they were before something painful happened?" Ethan considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not think we become who we were before," he replied. "I think we become someone stronger who still remembers how to be kind." Grace lowered her eyes, holding the warm cup between her hands. "I do not even remember what it feels like to make plans for my own future." Ethan smiled gently. "Then perhaps we begin with one small plan." She looked at him curiously. "Tomorrow," he said, "I would like to take you back to the university where you studied education. Not because you owe anyone anything, but because dreams deserve the chance to be remembered." Grace's eyes filled with quiet emotion. Before she could answer, Ethan's phone vibrated with an incoming message from his chief investigator. The brief report contained only one sentence, yet it confirmed the first real breakthrough in the investigation. The individual who had manipulated Grace's life for 2 years had finally been identified, and the evidence suggested the deception had begun much closer to her family than anyone had ever imagined. "I learned that the most painful deception is not convincing someone that they are powerless. It is convincing them that their suffering is necessary to protect the people they love." Ethan Sullivan read the investigation summary twice before quietly placing the report inside a leather folder. Every piece of verified evidence pointed toward the same heartbreaking conclusion. The anonymous promises Grace Bennett had believed for 2 years had never come from anyone connected to Noah's medical care. Instead, they originated from a former financial advisor who had once managed charitable donations for several local organizations before being dismissed for ethical violations years earlier. Rather than disappearing, he had continued exploiting vulnerable families by convincing them that their loved ones depended entirely on his influence. Grace had become one of his victims because she had been willing to sacrifice everything for her younger brother. Ethan instructed his legal team to continue working closely with law enforcement, making certain every step remained within proper legal procedures. He refused to confront anyone personally or allow emotion to replace evidence. Grace deserved the truth, but she also deserved a resolution built on justice rather than revenge. The following morning, Ethan kept the promise he had made the night before and drove Grace to the university where she had once studied elementary education. The beautiful campus looked almost unchanged. Autumn leaves drifted across familiar brick walkways while students hurried between classrooms carrying backpacks and coffee cups. Grace stood quietly beside the old library entrance, overwhelmed by memories she had buried beneath years of fear. "I used to spend every Friday afternoon here," she whispered with a gentle smile. There was a reading room upstairs where children from nearby schools visited every week. Ethan remained beside her without interrupting. Grace slowly walked through the building, stopping outside a classroom where future teachers were preparing lesson materials. One professor recognized her almost immediately. "Grace Bennett?" the woman asked with delighted surprise. Grace turned, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. The professor smiled warmly before embracing her. You were one of my brightest students. We all wondered what happened after you suddenly disappeared. Grace struggled to answer. Life became complicated. The professor nodded with quiet understanding. Your scholarship records are still here. You were only one semester away from graduation. Ethan noticed the disbelief on Grace's face. Only one semester? She repeated softly. The professor retrieved an academic file from her office and placed it in Grace's hands. Your credits remain valid. If you ever decide to return, the university would welcome you. Grace held the folder carefully, as though she were touching a forgotten version of herself. During the drive back to Manhattan, she stared silently at the enrollment papers resting on her lap. I never imagined I could come back, she admitted. Ethan smiled gently. Dreams do not disappear simply because life takes a difficult detour. Tears filled Grace's eyes. I spent 2 years believing my future had already ended. Ethan glanced toward her before returning his attention to the road. Perhaps your future was only waiting until you were finally free to choose it. That evening, after visiting Noah at the hospital, Grace noticed he seemed happier than she had seen him in years. He proudly showed her a drawing he had made of the three of them standing beneath a bright blue sky. Above the picture he had written in careful handwriting, "Families stay together." Grace smiled through grateful tears while Ethan quietly admired the child's hopeful heart. As they prepared to leave, Noah looked directly at Ethan. Will you keep taking care of my sister until she remembers how to smile every day? Ethan answered without hesitation. I promise. Standing just outside the hospital room, Grace heard every word. She realized that no one had ever made a promise to protect her without asking for something in return. For the first time since her difficult journey had begun, she allowed herself to believe that the life waiting ahead might be greater than the life she had lost. At that same moment, Ethan's chief investigator sent one final message confirming that the legal authorities had gathered enough documented evidence to meet with Grace the following morning and reveal the complete truth that would finally set her free from every lie she had carried alone. The moment the truth is finally spoken, fear loses the power it once held over every tomorrow. The following morning, Ethan Sullivan invited Grace Bennett to join him inside the quiet conference room of his legal office overlooking downtown Manhattan. The atmosphere was calm, private, and intentionally free from unnecessary formality. Present were Ethan, Grace, his lead attorney, and the senior investigator who had spent weeks gathering verified records through lawful channels. Ethan pulled out a chair for Grace before taking his own seat beside her instead of across the table. He wanted her to understand that they were facing the truth together, not standing on opposite sides of it. The investigator gently placed several organized folders on the table and spoke with careful compassion. Grace, everything we are about to show you has been verified through official records. We know this information may be difficult to hear, but it is important that you understand none of what happened was your fault. Grace quietly nodded, holding her hands together as she prepared herself. The investigator opened the first file containing hospital documentation from St. Matthew Children's Medical Center. Your brother's treatment was approved through an independent charitable foundation before the circumstances that changed your life. The funding remained secure from the first day until today without interruption. Grace looked down at the documents, her breathing growing slower as she carefully read every page. The investigator continued gently. The person who manipulated you knew how deeply you loved Noah. They falsely convinced you that your sacrifice was directly connected to his medical care, even though no such connection ever existed. Grace closed her eyes as silent tears escaped down her cheeks. She was not crying because she regretted protecting her brother. She was crying because she realized 2 years of fear had been built upon a carefully planned lie. Ethan quietly reached across the table, not to interrupt her grief, but simply to let his hand rest within reach if she chose to take it. After several moments, Grace slowly placed her trembling hand over his. No words were necessary. She had finally stopped carrying the burden alone. The attorney then explained that the investigation had identified the individual responsible through financial records, electronic communications, and witness statements. Appropriate legal proceedings had already begun, ensuring accountability through the justice system while protecting Grace's privacy. Ethan listened carefully before asking only one question. Will Grace and Noah remain completely safe? The investigator answered immediately. Yes, protective measures have already been arranged, and there is no indication of any continuing threat. Grace lowered her head as relief washed over her. For the first time in 2 years, she no longer had to wake each morning wondering whether one wrong decision would harm the person she loved most. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove Grace to St. Matthew Children's Medical Center so she could share the truth with Noah herself. Sitting beside his hospital bed, Grace gently explained that none of what had happened had ever been his fault and that they no longer had to live in fear. Noah listened quietly before wrapping his arms around his sister with the simple confidence only a child could offer. "Then we can finally make new memories," he whispered. Grace smiled through grateful tears and nodded. "Yes, we finally can." As they left the hospital together that evening, Ethan noticed Grace walking with a steadier posture than ever before. She was still healing, but every step now carried hope instead of fear. When they reached the estate, Grace paused beside the front entrance and looked toward the peaceful gardens glowing beneath the setting sun. "For 2 years I believed surviving was enough," she said softly. "Today I realized I am allowed to live again." Ethan smiled with quiet warmth. "And tomorrow," he replied, "we begin building the future that was waiting for you all along." Grace looked at him with a peaceful expression that had been impossible only days earlier. She no longer saw the powerful man who had rescued her from one locked room. She saw the person who had patiently unlocked every invisible door fear had built inside her heart. And for the first time since her difficult journey began, she believed that healing was no longer a distant dream, but the life already unfolding one hopeful day at a time. The greatest victory is not watching justice arrive. It is realizing that your future no longer belongs to your past. The weeks that followed brought a quiet transformation to the Sullivan estate. Grace Bennett no longer startled at every unexpected sound, and the constant uncertainty that had once followed her like a shadow slowly faded into memory. Each morning, she visited Noah before attending counseling sessions recommended by the hospital, and each afternoon she volunteered at the children's reading program she had rediscovered only days earlier. Ethan Sullivan never reminded her of how far she had come. Instead, he quietly celebrated every ordinary moment that fear no longer controlled. One bright Monday morning, Ethan accompanied Grace to the courthouse where the legal proceedings connected to the investigation officially began. She had been informed that she would not need to confront anyone directly. Her verified statements, financial records, electronic communications, and witness testimony were already sufficient for the court to continue through the proper legal process. As they entered the building, Grace hesitated briefly near the front steps. Ethan noticed immediately. "We can leave if this feels like too much," he said gently. Grace looked toward the courthouse doors before shaking her head with quiet determination. "For 2 years I believed I had no voice," she replied. "Today I am simply walking forward." Ethan smiled with quiet pride as they entered together. The legal meeting lasted less than an hour. Grace answered only a few carefully prepared questions while her attorney remained beside her throughout the process. Every official she met treated her with dignity and patience, making it clear that she was being heard, believed, and protected. When they finally stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, Grace released a slow breath she had unknowingly been holding. "It is over," she whispered. Ethan gently corrected her with a warm smile. "The fear is over. Your future is just beginning." Several days later, Noah received wonderful news from his medical team. His latest evaluations showed significant improvement, allowing doctors to begin discussing a long-term recovery plan and fewer hospital visits. Noah celebrated by asking only for a simple picnic with his sister and Ethan beside the Hudson River. The following Saturday, they spread a blanket beneath a large maple tree while Noah eagerly unpacked homemade sandwiches prepared by the estate kitchen. Between bites of lunch, Noah proudly handed Grace a folded sheet of paper. "I made another drawing," he announced. Grace opened it carefully. This time the picture showed 3 people standing outside a small school surrounded by smiling children. Above them, Noah had written, "Miss Grace's Reading House." Grace laughed softly through happy tears. "That is a beautiful dream," she said. Noah looked at Ethan with complete confidence. "She can do it now, right?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "I believe she already has everything she needs." Grace looked between the 2 people who had become her greatest source of hope and quietly realized that they believed in her even before she fully believed in herself. A month later, Grace stood inside the same university where she had once thought her future had ended. Surrounded by welcoming professors and familiar classrooms, she officially completed the paperwork to return for her final semester. As she signed the enrollment documents, she paused for a moment before looking toward Ethan. "You never tried to decide my future for me," she said softly. "You only reminded me that I still had one." Ethan smiled with calm sincerity. "Because it was always yours." As they walked across the campus together beneath colorful autumn trees, Grace understood that healing was not forgetting difficult memories. Healing meant those memories no longer decided who she would become. She slipped her university acceptance folder beneath her arm and smiled toward the path ahead. For the first time in years, every step she took belonged entirely to her own hopes instead of someone else's lies, and Ethan quietly walked beside her, never leading, never pulling, simply remaining close enough that she would always know she would never have to face another tomorrow alone. Love becomes real the moment gratitude quietly transforms into choice. 6 months passed with remarkable peace settling over the lives of Grace Bennett, Noah Bennett, and Ethan Sullivan. Winter slowly gave way to the first warm days of spring, and the Sullivan estate seemed brighter than ever before. Grace successfully returned to the university, completing the final semester she had once believed she would never finish. Every afternoon after class, she volunteered at local elementary schools, helping children discover the same joy in reading that had first inspired her dream years earlier. Noah continued growing stronger with each medical appointment, and his doctors celebrated every improvement with genuine optimism. Ethan watched these quiet victories from a respectful distance, never trying to shape Grace's future according to his own wishes. Instead, he simply made certain every opportunity she had once lost was now waiting for her whenever she chose to reach for it. One Saturday morning, Grace received an unexpected phone call from the principal of a newly established community learning center supported by the Sullivan Foundation. "We have been following your volunteer work," the principal explained warmly. "Our board would like to offer you the position of Director of Children's Literacy Programs after your graduation." Grace stood speechless in the university courtyard, overwhelmed by an opportunity that once felt impossible. When she returned to the estate that evening, she found Ethan reading quietly beside the fireplace. He immediately noticed the excitement shining in her eyes. "Something wonderful happened today," he said with a gentle smile before she could speak. Grace laughed softly. "How did you know?" Ethan closed his book. "Because that is the happiest smile I have ever seen." Grace handed him the official offer letter. He carefully read every page before looking back at her with unmistakable pride. "You earned this," he said simply. Grace shook her head with grateful emotion. "I never would have reached this moment without you." Ethan quietly folded the letter and returned it to her hands. "You reached this moment because you never stopped being the person who wanted to help children, even after life became unfair. I only removed the obstacles standing in your way." His words settled deeply inside her heart. That evening, the Sullivan Foundation hosted a small celebration honoring volunteers who had dedicated their time to community education. Grace stood among teachers, librarians, and families whose lives had been touched by kindness instead of recognition. During the ceremony, the foundation chairman unexpectedly invited Ethan to address the guests. Ethan stepped to the podium with his usual calm confidence before looking directly toward Grace. "Many people believe leadership is measured by influence," he began. "I have learned it is measured by the number of lives someone quietly helps without expecting applause." He paused before smiling warmly. "Tonight, I would like to recognize a woman who reminded all of us that compassion survives even after the hardest seasons of life. Her courage did not come from never feeling afraid. It came from continuing to care for others while carrying burdens no one else could see." Grace lowered her eyes as the room filled with heartfelt applause. After the ceremony ended, she and Ethan walked slowly through the peaceful gardens surrounding the estate. The evening air carried the gentle fragrance of blooming roses, while soft lights reflected across the nearby river. Grace finally stopped beneath the same flowering tree where they had once shared one of their earliest conversations. She looked at Ethan with quiet certainty. "There is something I have wanted to tell you for a long time." Ethan waited patiently without speaking. Grace smiled through grateful tears. When you found me, I thought you had saved my life. Now I understand something much greater. You never asked me to become someone different. You simply gave me the chance to become myself again. Ethan's expression softened with genuine emotion. That was always enough. Grace slowly reached for his hand, not because she needed protection anymore, but because she wanted to share every tomorrow with the man who had shown her what unconditional respect truly looked like. For the first time, the gesture came entirely from her own heart, and Ethan gently intertwined his fingers with hers, knowing that the strongest bond between them had never been created by rescue alone, but by the quiet freedom they had given each other to choose love every single day. The most beautiful endings are not the ones where someone is rescued. They are the ones where that person finally discovers they were always worthy of being loved. 1 year later, the Sullivan Foundation welcomed hundreds of families to the grand opening of the Grace Bennett Children's Literacy Center overlooking the Hudson River. Bright murals covered the walls, shelves overflowed with colorful books, and laughter echoed through every reading room as children eagerly explored a place built entirely to inspire hope. At the entrance, a simple bronze plaque carried a message chosen by Grace herself. Every child deserves a safe place to dream. She paused for a quiet moment before opening the front doors, remembering how impossible that future had once seemed. Noah Bennett, now healthier and full of energy, proudly greeted every visitor while wearing a volunteer badge almost as large as his smile. His latest medical evaluations showed remarkable progress, and his physicians believed he would continue living a healthy, active life. Watching her younger brother run through the center without fear became the greatest gift Grace had ever received. During the opening ceremony, community leaders thanked Ethan Sullivan for funding the project, but he gently redirected every compliment toward the woman standing beside him. Buildings can be financed, he said with his familiar calm voice. Hope can only be created by people who choose compassion every single day. Grace taught all of us that kindness is stronger than fear, and this center exists because she refused to let difficult years define the rest of her life. Grace looked toward him with grateful emotion before quietly shaking her head. I did not do this alone, she replied. Someone believed in me before I remembered how to believe in myself. Warm applause filled the hall, but the only sound that truly mattered to either of them was the joyful laughter of children discovering stories that might someday change their own lives. Later that evening, after the celebration ended, Ethan and Grace walked slowly through the peaceful gardens surrounding the Sullivan estate, while the setting sun painted the river with shades of gold. Noah raced ahead, happily chasing butterflies across the lawn before waving back toward them with cheerful excitement. Grace smiled as she watched him disappear among the blooming flowers. He finally has the childhood he always deserved, she whispered. Ethan nodded quietly. And so do you. Grace stopped walking and turned toward him. You know, she said softly, people often tell stories about heroes breaking down doors to rescue someone. They never talk about what happens afterward. Ethan smiled gently. What do you think happens afterward? Grace reached for his hand with complete confidence. The real rescue begins. Someone patiently teaches another person that they no longer have to live in fear. Ethan looked into her eyes with the same quiet respect that had existed from the first day they met. He removed a small velvet box from his jacket pocket and opened it slowly, revealing a simple diamond ring. Grace Bennett, he said warmly. This time there are no obligations, no conditions, and no promises made because of fear. There is only one question. Will you build the rest of your life with me because it is what your heart truly wants? Tears of happiness filled Grace's eyes as she smiled brighter than he had ever seen. Yes, she whispered. I choose you. Freely, completely, and forever. Noah clapped enthusiastically from across the garden before running toward them with joyful laughter. As the three of them embraced beneath the evening sky, Grace realized that the locked room where Ethan had first found her no longer held any power over her future. That chapter had ended the moment someone chose compassion instead of control, patience instead of pressure, and hope instead of fear. Their story had never been about surviving darkness. It had always been about discovering that love is not measured by how tightly someone holds you, but by how gently they help you find your own strength. And as the lights of the estate welcomed them home, they stepped forward together not as people defined by yesterday, but but as a family united by trust, healing, justice, and the quiet certainty that the brightest chapters of their lives were only just beginning.